program as a name is very well known. The figure of J. William Fulbright is not. He's a kind of historical figure which is unfamiliar to many of the younger generation. So I wanted to say a few words about J. William Fulbright, the man who gave us the name Fulbright. He was born in 1905. He died in 1995. And he was an American politician, academic, and statesman. He represented Arkansas in the United States Senate. And he was the longest serving chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And this gets to the heart of the matter, because if I think that when people think of J. William Fulbright, they think of two things. The first thing they think of was his principled opposition to President Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time of the Vietnam War. And secondly, very early in his career, 1946, when he, in a way, was responsible for the creation of the International Fellowship Program that bears his name. So he's someone well worth remembering. And looking into his story, I actually remembered one of his most famous speeches, one of his most famous addresses, was delivered in May 1966. In May 1966, Fulbright gave a lecture at my alma mater, Johns Hopkins, which was called The Arrogance of Power. And that essay was later republished in a book which became a bestseller. And a few years ago, the book was republished again, this time with a foreword by Bill Clinton on the arrogance of power. And the question there was, what was he talking about? I heartily recommend that you go online and reread this lecture, this lesson that he gave, because it has a certain validity today. He was talking about the arrogance of American power in 1966. And he said, I quote, "The United States is in danger of losing its perspective on what exactly is within the realm of its power and what is beyond it. He worried we are not living up to our capacity and promise as a civilized power for the world." And then on page 2, a great quotation, he says, "I wish to convey in these lectures that America will escape those fatal temptations of power which have ruined other great nations and will instead do only that good in the world which it can do, both by direct effort and by force of its own example." So as I say, this is really quite a wonderful lecture that meant a lot to the generation of 1966, a Democratic senator standing up to a Democratic president on the principal question of foreign policy. So I think Fulbright echoes over time in many, many respects. And I think, so not only are we happy to have this Fulbright professorship, but I think we're also happy to be part of this tradition of J. William Fulbright. Now, to introduce our speaker, Jeff Engel is the David Gergen Director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. He has been trained at Cornell, Oxford, and Yale. He has a PhD in American history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author or editor of some 13 books on American foreign policy and the presidency. The latest one is called When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. But more interestingly, maybe a new edition of this is going to come out, I learned. He co-authored a book called Impeachment in American History. So let's hope for the best in all senses of the term. To get down to what he's doing for us here, he is teaching 2 courses this year. I said one of the great advantages of this Fulbright professor is we can cover American history, American foreign policy more directly. He's teaching 2 courses for us this year, one on 20th century American foreign policy and another on 20th century American political history. This evening's lecture is co-sponsored by the Fulbright Austria and by the Austrian Fulbright alumni. This event also serves as a IDS, an interdisciplinary lecture seminar for our second-year students. And what this means in practice is that they're going to get the first crack in asking the questions when question time goes around. But the general format will be a presentation by Jeff Engel, followed by the discussion, and followed very generously by a reception next door offered by Fulbright Austria. So Jeff, the floor is yours.
I'm not sure how to start this. You can figure it out while I do something else. Okay, thank you, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. It has been an absolute pleasure to be here now for a couple months, actually, and I've taught this last term, and I'm going to be teaching again next term, so it's been a kind of a fun experience getting to know my fellow Fulbrighters who just arrived about 96 hours ago. There are very few times I can feel experienced, but, you know, I had 2 months of Vienna on them. So I do want to offer some appreciations and some thanks. First of all, to Ambassador Brix, also to Marcus Combrost, Tom Rowe, of course, Deputy Director Martina Schubert, and Anna Exinger, who's truly been helpful in getting me set up here. I also need to thank the Fulbright Austria Commission, including Hermann Gies and Franziska Brunner. They have been wonderful hosts. And also I want to make a note to say thank you to our American diplomats who are here from the tri-mission that the United States has here in Vienna. This is not an easy time to be an American diplomat, and many of us appreciate your service more and more and more. I also do want to thank my deans back in College Station, that's where I used to be, back in college, back in Dallas, Tom DiPiero and Nathan Balke, and of course the supporters of the Center for Presidential History. And finally, before I kick off, I want to give a special thank you to my students from this semester. I think my colleagues at home are quite annoyed at this point at the number of messages that they get from me saying, "You would not believe how good these students are." It has been an astounding experience. I don't think the students quite appreciated that they were going to be lab rats for me to try to understand what European young people thought about American politics. And I appreciate the fact that most of the times that the students this semester have asked a question about what's going on in American politics, they are kind enough to allow me the few moments to shake my head before we start. I am actually happy to answer questions, not that I have answers, but at least offer commentary on any questions about the current situation in Washington, both diplomatically and domestically, because I can only imagine there are thoughts going through your minds. But let me begin. I begin by telling you about the title, Seeking Monsters to Destroy. It's a play off a famous speech by arguably the greatest Secretary of State in American history, John Quincy Adams. And I know he was the greatest Secretary of State in American history, not because of his accomplishments, not necessarily because of his training, but because my college advisor used to say, when you do a list of the greatest Secretaries of State in American history, you say John Quincy Adams, and then you pause. Because there's such a gap, he would argue, between him and everyone else. Which is what makes it all the more fun for me to disagree with John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams gave a speech in the 1810s in which he said the United States does not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy. We are a champion of all liberty, but a protector of our own. I think he's wrong. I think explicitly the United States actually purposely looks for monsters to destroy, looks for individual monsters to destroy. And this project that I've been working on for 20 years now is about how the United States, when it comes to choose its enemies, and more importantly, I think when it comes to describe its enemies, those enemies politically, internationally, militarily, oftentimes, almost invariably, chooses an individual face to focus upon. Chooses not just an individual face, but an individual tyrannical leader who is the cause of international problems. However, importantly, that's only some of the time. And the some of the time is a really interesting part, because I argue that American policymakers choose that individual face for a foreign enemy when the foreign enemy is, well, frankly, like us. Whatever like us means at any particular time in American history. And when a foreign people is not like us, well, let's just say it's a different war entirely. So let me begin. Oh, it works much better when you turn it on. There we go. Let me begin with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the man in the white pants and dark-colored jacket there, who had a serious problem in 1914, and again in 1915, and again in 1916, and then again in 1917. And that problem was not just World War I. It was not just the fact that American shipping was being routinely destroyed by German U-boats on the high seas. It was not just the fact that American corporations were deeply indebted to the Allies and therefore in need of their victory. It was not simply the fact that he had a country that was traditionally isolationist in an age when he thought the United States needed to be more engaged in the world. Now, the real problem that Woodrow Wilson had in 1917 is this. This map highlights the percentage and the concentration of Germans. That is to say, people born in Germany, people derived from German stock, who lived in the United States at the time. I will point out two particular centers. The first is Wisconsin, where I went to graduate school, and the second is North Texas, where I live now. But if you also look at other places like Pennsylvania, some parts of Ohio, some parts of Michigan, you would, if you were driving around in 1917, first of all, I'd say congratulations for driving around in 1917, but more importantly, you would likely, more likely than not, in a small town, wind up meeting people who spoke German, as opposed to English. Now, this is only a problem given the international system of World War I. In particular, this is a problem because once Woodrow Wilson makes the strategic decision, which takes him a long time to get there, once he makes a strategic decision by 1917 that the United States does in fact need to enter the war, and enter the war on the side fighting Germany, he has a basic problem, which is the British, see this British poster, see this British poster here, the British could very easily use fundamental hate as a way to motivate their people to fight in this war. When you see British war posters of this time, they oftentimes refer to the Hun. They oftentimes refer to the devilish figure that we see in this French poster here, in which we are demonstrating, portraying, telling our people that the enemy is an other. The enemy is not like us. The enemy is evil. The enemy is subhuman. The enemy is dangerous. Well, obviously, Woodrow Wilson can't do that. Woodrow Wilson can't go to the American people in April of 1917 and say, I want a declaration of war so we can go kill a bunch of Germans. That's not going to play well in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in Ohio, etc. And it's not going to play particularly well because many of the people in the United States who speak German and are of German derivation, many of them still have relatives back in the old country. Many of them have relatives, therefore, who, if the United States were to go to war, they might philosophically or in fact find themselves fighting against. So Woodrow Wilson is basically precluded from using this basic trope that is basically fundamental to all of military history, by the way. You can go back almost throughout the entire whole human civilization. You can always find people when they're talking about fighting an enemy who tries to say the enemy is subhuman. The enemy is not like us. The enemy will destroy us. The enemy are monsters. Woodrow Wilson does not have that trope, so he comes up with something else. He makes the argument in his World War I Declaration of War address. Remember, it's a declaration of war, which is not it's a declaration asking Congress to declare war. He makes the argument that we have no quarrel with the German people. Okay, just stop and think about that. We're about to go kill a lot of them. And a lot of them are about to kill a lot of us. But we have no quarrel, he said, with the German people. It was not upon them that the government acted in entering the war. The enemy, he said, was the Kaiser. The enemy, he said, was the Kaiser and his henchmen. The enemy were those evil aristocrats of old who throughout history had used their own power for their own advantage, not for the advantage of their people, and had taken the people, common people, good people, connected across borders people, and put them at odds with each other. Now, this was tremendously successful for Wilson. The United States enters the war, and by the way, according to most Americans, won the war. We'll get back to that in a second. But Wilson's phrase actually, I think, transforms American diplomacy throughout the 20th century and into our 21st. And in fact, I want to point out the thing that actually drew me to this project in the first place, which is a similarity, an echo. Historians sometimes look for echoes in history and say, why do we see the same thing happening again and again and again? So in 1917, Woodrow Wilson, as you've now seen, said, we have no quarrel with the German people. Well, Harry Truman said, we have no quarrel with the people of the Soviet Union. Dwight Eisenhower, we have no quarrel with the Cuban people. Richard Nixon, when he was vice president, mind you, we have no quarrel with the Cuban people either. He's on message. John Kennedy also has no quarrel with the people of Cuba. We have no quarrel with them. Jimmy Carter, we have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. Ronald Reagan, we have no quarrel with you, the Soviet people. George H.W. Bush, we have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. Bill Clinton, who also, by the way, said we have no quarrel with the people of Iraq, but I think you're getting the point at this point, made the point that we have no quarrel with the Serbian people as well. And of course, George W. Bush said we have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. So did Barack Obama. And Donald Trump has not used the word quarrel, insert your own joke here, but he has, I think, expressed the same idea. And I want to stress, for those who have perhaps not spent a lot of time in the United States, you never hear anybody use the word quarrel. George Bush, junior or senior, let's go with junior. George Bush made his entire political persona out of being a man of the frontier, a man of the people, a man of the dirt, a man who was willing to and enjoyed spending time clearing brush as his favorite hobby and activity. George Bush was not known for his verbal acuity. And George Bush, I can assure you, never organically used the word quarrel in his entire life. Why then do policymakers keep coming back to this word, this idea, again and again and again, including today? Secretary of State Blinken, former Secretary of State Blinken, of course, said this about the Russian people. We have no quarrel with them, talking, of course, about the conflict in Ukraine. And by the way, the current Secretary of State also said, we have no quarrel with Russia. Our problem is with Putin. Though I note he said this in 2017 when a senator. And in case you're wondering why it's not proper English, it was a tweet. That tells you all you need to know about tweets, I guess. And of course, this idea has infused our popular culture as well, which is one of the things I'm going to describe today. So much so that perhaps one of the most famous Americans in all of the 20th century, Muhammad Ali, used this as his primary justification when deciding not to obey this draft order to go to Vietnam. Now, like most good things, the history of this starts at the beginning. Starts at the American Revolution. And it starts, in essence, because Americans, up until, well, we don't exactly know the exact moment, but let's say sometime in early 1776, Americans had an important cognitive shift, I argue. It's not just my argument. This is the main historical thesis of the day. The cognitive shift that transformed their blaming and their finding fault over why there were so many problems in transatlantic relations from blaming Parliament to blaming the king. In fact, more specifically, there was throughout the crisis years of the 1760s and 1770s, a very popular notion among Americans that there was, in fact, some kind of cabal or conspiracy, which is overriding American liberties, designed to destroy American liberties, and if only the king knew about it, he would make it better. This explains, of course, the Olive Branch Petition, the document on the right, from 1775, July, in which Americans address, from the Continental Congress, address the king and say to the king, we are loyal subjects, please help us. In essence, the message is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's also important from a philosophical standpoint. The message is, dear king, you must not be aware of the terrible things happening to us. Because if you were aware of the terrible things happening to us, you would solve them. There are people around you who are hurting us, your subjects, your loyal subjects. Within a year, that changes entirely. We can see that change in the Declaration of Independence, Much more famous document, obviously. Now, you probably remember the Declaration of Independence if you know any part of it from the preamble. That's basically just Thomas Jefferson clearing his throat. The preamble and the conclusion, the part that says, we bind ourselves together for this cause, that's actually only about 30% of the document. Most of the document, instead, is essentially a lawyer's brief, a series of accusations that say, he being the king, he has set Native Americans against us. He has destroyed the good offices of our elected officials. He has resolved to put troops among us, etc., etc., etc. More than 24 statements saying he. Now, who is the he? Well, it's King George. There's a fundamental shift that occurs at the moment of inception of the United States in which Americans say that their primary enemy are not foreign peoples, but rather a singular tyrant with a singular face. And we know that Americans responded to the Declaration of Independence in this proper way. First of all, you have to understand, this document was designed to be read out loud. And when it was read out loud, throughout the colonies, certainly read out loud by George Washington to his army in New York awaiting a British invasion, when that document was read out loud, the crowd almost invariably had the exact right reaction. They would look around the room or look around the public square and find whatever looked to them like royal authority and burn it. Whether that's a picture of the king, whether that's a statue of the king, whether that's a royal crest representing the king. In fact, there used to be, I can't stress that word enough, used to be, a really remarkable tall statue of King George III down by Wall Street in New York. It was there up until the night that the Declaration of Independence was read, at which point the crowd tore down the statue and ultimately used its parts, melted down, to form bullets. The idea being, and many, many commentators at the time made this joke, the idea being that we will have his royal subjects will enjoy having royalty thrown against them, in essence. But there's more than just identifying an enemy at play here. Because George Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army at the time, of course, George Washington was very cognizant that this was not just a plain civil war raging within the British Empire, between the British and the Americans. It was actually more complicated than that, and not least of which because of the presence of German-speaking populations and German-speaking troops. Most famously, referred to as the Hessians, mercenaries who were hired from Germany in order to come over and do the king's bidding in destroying American lives and property. Now, a couple of things about this. The first is, and I need to say this delicately because I have so very much enjoyed my time here in Austria, where people speak German. I don't know if you're aware of that, but outside the Diplomatic Academy, they do. But Germans were not popular throughout much of the 18th century in the United States. Benjamin Franklin, not a president, but perhaps the most famous non-president we've ever had, was quite adamant throughout most of his political career that the thing that was going to destroy America was all these Germans coming. Because they didn't talk like us, they didn't sound like us, they didn't have our background institutions. In fact, many of them, here's the thing, didn't even learn English, he said. In fact, Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s wrote a whole series of pamphlets talking about how terrible it's going to be, the destruction of the American system of government, when they realize that they have to publish everything in two languages, German and English. And I point this out because Benjamin Franklin did not make this argument by the time of the American Revolution, 20 years later. Now, I want to be careful here. We should always be careful trying to interpret what Benjamin Franklin said because he's funnier and smarter than the rest of us combined. But I know for a fact that in the 1750s, he was saying essentially, Germans get out. And by the 1770s, he was saying, Germans come here. Not just any Germans, mind you, but the Hessian soldiers. He and George Washington and others like them came to the conclusion that what we really should do when facing off against Hessian soldiers across the field is not shoot them unless we have to. More importantly, we should try to woo them to our side. We have Germans in our community who might be able to go and speak to them in their own language. We have Germans in our community who might be willing to welcome them as friends and neighbors. We, in fact, have a situation by the 1780 in which many of the different state legislatures promised rewards and bounties to Hessian soldiers who switched sides, who defected. I believe, if I remember correctly, in Pennsylvania in 1780, if you were a Hessian soldier, you received some land and a goat, which is a good deal, because you also don't get shot, the idea being, if you leave the king's service and fly off into the hinterland, fly off towards the frontier. And as you can see from 1776, George Washington was quite clear that we should go and try to solicit Hessian participation in our cause. Even if you're not going to join our cause and at least don't fight for the British anymore, disappear into the German-speaking population. Because as you can see, George Washington was aware, we have no quarrel with them, those German speakers. They too, the argument went, were being controlled, directed, manipulated by their own king. None of them wanted to be there by their own volition. And in fact, if they weren't off fighting here, they'd probably be off fighting somewhere else, was the logic. In either case, they're not fighting for themselves like we are in our revolution. They're fighting because a king told them to. Worse than that, they're fighting because their own king sold them to the British king. The Boston Gazette, for example, just one example, made the point explicitly over and over again, though again you can find this in multiple places, that we should try to appeal to the Hessian soldiers because they would make good settlers. They are in fact forced into service and imprisoned. Now, here's where it gets really fun, by which I mean really uncomfortable. Whenever one does a comparative history project, trying to figure out and tease out what were the ways in which Americans not only thought but acted, it's imperative to have multiple different examples, things to compare, if you will. So, make a long story short, that same language of join us, of be one with us, be a good settler with us, take our side, was used whenever the Americans fought British, whenever the Americans fought the German, or fought against Germans, whenever the Americans, and they did this multiple times, invaded Canada. By the way, user tip. One of the things that we learned from the American Revolution is if you're going to invade Canada, don't start in October. It doesn't work out well for the troops involved. But yet they made that mistake multiple times. But that was not, however, the way in which American soldiers fought Native Americans at the same time. Native Americans who could not become, by virtue of American sensibilities, could not become part of the body politic. Native Americans who, in fact, according to the first naturalization and immigration laws passed after the Revolution, I'll grant you, which said that only somebody who is white and male can become a citizen, emphasis on the white part, and Native Americans were never offered the opportunity to join the Union. Rather, Native Americans in the Revolutionary War were fought against as wars of extermination. I point you to the Sullivan raid, a Sullivan expedition against Iroquois tribes in villages in northern New York, stemming into Canada, actually no, not Canada, stemming down into Ohio. This is a message from George Washington to General Sullivan, giving him his orders. You will ruin their crops and prevent them from planting more. You will go against the hostile people their associates and adherents. Your goal is destruction and devastation. Your goal, he said, is essentially to make life so miserable for those Indians that they will put some distance between themselves and us. In fact, the word which was most often used in the orders, in the directives, in the discussions of how American soldiers and commanders were supposed to treat Indians, Native Americans, was not the word that we use today. We might use the word today, exterminate. The word of art at the time was actually somewhat different. We don't use it much anymore. It was extirpate. Extirpate. When's the last time any of you used the word extirpate? Extirpate means more than just exterminate. It means exterminate and root out the ability for something to reproduce ever again. We don't just want to kill all the Native Americans, Washington told his soldiers. We want to make it impossible for them to ever return. One way that we know this happened, and American soldiers were very uncomfortable in doing this, by the way, one way which you know this happened is that Americans violated several of the basic fundamental norms and laws of war at the time. Now, these had not necessarily been written down all that effectively. There's still a lot of argument. There's still a lot of argument today over what actually is or is not a war crime, for example. But one thing that lawyers and legal scholars and generals were all very clear about is when you attacked a foreign land, it was okay to kill people. It was okay to burn property. It was okay to burn annual crops, but under no circumstance should you destroy fruit trees. Why? Because fruit trees take many years to rebuild. And if we want to make an enemy unhappy, we can burn their corn. They'll be hungry for a while and maybe capitulate, but they'll all survive when they make corn next year. If I destroy your fruit trees, on the other hand, as was done to Native Americans in the Sullivan Campaign and others, this is a sign that we want to denude the land of its ability to sustain you entirely, a violation of the regular rules of war at the time. And it's important to note that these are not isolated incidents. In fact, one thing which is typically not taught in American history classes in high school or elsewhere is that approximately 1/4 of all continental soldiers, I'm going to say that again, 1/4 of all continental soldiers did not fight against the British, did not fight against Hessians, but instead fought against Native Americans. Native Americans who typically were allied with the British, yes, but the actual fighting was not done in the standard European way that we like to see of armies lining up against each other and blasting each other with muskets. It was done in a more savage, barbaric, frontier way. One way that we know that the Americans treated their enemies differently, depending on who they were during the same conflict, is not just to look at what they did to fruit trees, but also to look at what they did to prisoners. So you have probably heard that being a prisoner of any side in the Revolutionary War was not great for your health. American soldiers were typically put into camps or, more often, put into large, basically decommissioned ships in harbors, where most of them died. But I want to stress something about the way most of them died. By the way, have I mentioned that there's some unpleasantness in this talk? I have a postdoc who is working on white supremacist extremist violence, and she and I would meet sometimes in the hallway when we just couldn't take our own stuff anymore. It was just too depressing. So this is one of those moments. Most of the time, if you were an American soldier and you were taken prisoner, you were quite likely to die from disease. You were quite likely to die from the fact that, hey, most soldiers at this time died from disease. Many, many more soldiers died from disease than died from fighting the enemy, even the ones who were not captured. This is not a healthy time. Have I mentioned no antibiotics and no vaccines? So, consequently, American soldiers, when placed under British care, oftentimes did not fare well, but comparatively speaking, they were treated quite well. What does that mean? They weren't killed. They weren't tortured typically. They were fed routinely. Not great, but enough to keep you alive. And we know this because some people survived. That was not the case when Native Americans met Americans. The Native Americans met Continentals, or in particular, American state militias. There's actually a very famous portrait cartoon that was publicized during the war, pointing out that the real reason the British are bad, the real reason the British are bad isn't just that they're bad on their own, it's because they're inciting and paying these savages to fight us. And I'll encourage you to look, though perhaps not too closely if you haven't had dinner yet, look closely at what is being done to the prisoners and the people who were captured by those Native Americans. They're being scalped. There is not a single instance, there is not a single documented instance of American and British soldiers scalping each other. However, when Americans fought Native Americans, both sides routinely scalped the other. And this is a pattern that continues throughout the 19th century, demonstrating, I think, that Americans in their military affairs treat people who are not like them more violently, more savagely, differently. Now, this pattern continues repeatedly. My book, I think, is turning out to be about 850 pages, so I'm not going to be able to cover every nuance in the next 20 minutes. But I do want to point out that this pattern reappears in the Civil War. Well, that makes sense. Soldiers were brother against brother fighting each other, and therefore, whenever Americans during the Civil War met each other, they typically conducted themselves within the range of civilized warfare at the time. Not, however, when Americans fought Native Americans at the same time. We have incredible records of commanders, especially on the frontier, especially in places like New Mexico, which was actually a very hotly contested battle zone during the early years of the Civil War, being given dual commands. When you find Confederates, capture them. When you find Native Americans, kill them and their kids too. Again and again and again. And of course, the only way that this logic makes sense, that we're not fighting against another people, that we can justify it, is to say, well, that other people, much like the British, much like the Hessians, must be being duped by their tyrant. Which is why we see Abraham Lincoln referred to repeatedly as a tyrant by Confederate authors. This is why we see Jefferson Davis referred to repeatedly as a tyrant by Union writers and journalists. The idea being that the average common person would never want to fight against someone that's so much like them. They must be being manipulated. They must be being controlled. They must be being oppressed by a tyrant. Which is why you will not find, or if you do, you won't find many, you will not find propaganda from either side saying, exterminate the Union troops, exterminate the Confederate troops, certainly not extirpate their region where their civilians live. Well, there's one caveat to that. The Confederates used that language explicitly whenever they fought African American troops in the Union. Again, demonstrating that when you're fighting someone who you think is beneath you on the civilizational hierarchy, savagery is the order of the day. This reappears in places where there is not actual fighting, or at least not much. For example, the Panama Canal has been in the news lately. Insert your own joke here. Theodore Roosevelt, when explaining his decision to intervene in what was essentially a Colombian civil war / insurrection, in which Panamanian officials negotiated with American officials in the Roosevelt administration ahead of time to say, if we rise up against Colombia, you'll protect us, right? And in exchange, we'll sell you a canal or space to build a canal. The documentation on this is unbelievably good. No historian doubts it anymore. And I think it's important to note how Theodore Roosevelt understood this himself. He was very upset with the Colombians for breaking a series of treaties that the Americans had signed previously, which is why they had to go and do all this shenanigans trying to get and instigate a violent revolution in Panama. He was very upset with them because the Colombian leadership was not doing what proper leaders did, which was take care of their own people. In fact, Roosevelt explicitly said, I will now do this on behalf of the Panamanian people. The trope has evolved in some ways so that now it's not just that American policymakers want to say our enemies are being oppressed. They want to say we have an obligation to anyone who is being, well, maybe not oppressed, may not be the best word, but not being treated all that well by their own government. That tyranny and monsters are so terrible that we have an obligation to go and eliminate them. Which brings us back to Woodrow Wilson and his decision to use the phrase, we have no quarrel. Now, I want to show you, coming up, a series of war posters that make this point. I think that's actually more interesting than just me showing you quote after quote after quote from Woodrow Wilson saying the Kaiser is a problem. In fact, when you see a war poster, if you see one that says Hun, if you see one that says Bosch, that's probably British or French. If you see one that talks about the Kaiser, it's probably American. Why? Because what good-hearted, American, German-raised boy wouldn't want to go and defeat the tyrant who's oppressing his homeland? I can't get Pennsylvania, Texas, Ohio, Wisconsin. I can't get them on board to exterminate other Germans. That's basically suicide. At the very least, fratricide. But I can get them on board to take out the Kaiser. I love this one. Stenographers, the Kaiser is worried about you. Uncle Sam, help stamp out the Kaiser. To hell with the Kaiser. It goes on and on and on. Capturing the unspeakable monster of the world. I like this one. Canned vegetables, fruit, and the Kaiser too. And of course, part and parcel of this is an ongoing redefinition of what it means to be a proper American. Because this is a moment when the idea of the melting pot, literally the moment when the idea of the melting pot comes about. That was actually a play from 1908 called The Melting Pot that puts the idea that people can come from anywhere, be fused in together, and become one peoples, no matter where they're from. Well, almost. Because it turns out that there are still peoples who are not included in the American self-identification. Most explicitly, Asians are actually basically precluded from immigrating to the United States until 1965. I guess I said 1965. Because they're not properly capable of becoming American. Now, there are some here, but they can only become a citizen, not by immigrating. If you're German, if you're Austrian, if you're Russian, you can immigrate to the United States and become a citizen. If you are Japanese or Chinese, you cannot. Why? Because the law is very clear, you must be white. Now, I have to point out, it's usually a lot easier to tell when someone is not white than when somebody is white. That is to say, judges did never do a great job of defining exactly what whiteness means. But it's much easier to say, I don't know what whiteness means, but I know you're not it. And we see this happening in the rhetoric of World War II. Franklin Roosevelt, using the same logic, saying, we are fighting against Hitler, not the German people. We are fighting against Mussolini, not the Italian people. But we are fighting against the Japanese in totality. The posters, the propaganda, made a point of highlighting this point. Hitler is the one that we are after. Waste helps the enemy. Catch him with his panzers down. In fact, Roosevelt, in 1944, when discussing basically the awareness that people were having that concentration camps existed and people were being exterminated, in 1944, yes, not 1945 when they were uncovered, said Hitler is committing these crimes and Germans, good Germans, should stand up against him. Now, it's important to note, this is all propaganda. What is propaganda? Propaganda is a message designed to influence you politically. It didn't used to be a bad word like it is today. It used to be a rather common word. Now we just call it messaging. Well, it turns out Franklin Roosevelt was very clear in his private correspondence that he really didn't like the Germans. He usually talked about them as Prussians, that the Prussians were the problem. And in fact, he and his good buddy and neighbor, Henry Morgenthau, who happens to be the Secretary of the Treasurer, come up with a plan for what to do with Germany after World War II, after we've defeated them, and that is to pasteurize it. No, I didn't say pasteurize. That's a more violent process. Pasteurize, do away with all of its industry. So Germany, if it's only agrarian, can never go to war against the world again. This is what Roosevelt thought personally. This is what he said publicly. We are fighting the Nazis, and we are fighting the Japs. Apologies for the unpleasant language, but it's important to note that Americans at the time really did think that they were fighting two different wars, one against an equivalent civilizational enemy in Europe and a race war in the Pacific. And when I say race war, please understand, the Japanese also thought they were fighting a race war. This was a war in which neither side took prisoners. This was a war in which neither side gave quarter to the enemy. We can see this, for example, I'll read just a little bit. Dwight Eisenhower, commander of American forces, tells American troops on D-Day that we are going to destroy the German war machine and eliminate Nazi tyranny over people. When asked what his war aims were in the Pacific, the commander of the Central Fleet, Bill Halsey, said, "My war aim is to kill Japs, kill more Japs." Eisenhower never said, "My war aim is to kill Germans, kill more Germans." If he had, a third of his army would have walked away. And we can see this by the dehumanization of the Japanese in those same messaging programs. You just will not find, it is inconceivable to find a poster that says, "Stay on the job until every German is dead." But that was perfectly fine and frequently said about the Japanese. Germans were treated quite well as prisoners. My grandfather actually was a POW guard in North Dakota of German prisoners. These are their barracks, those Germans who were shipped to North Dakota in order to be held during the war. And of course, I'll remind you that at the same time, the United States was building barracks for American citizens who happened to be of Japanese descent. Again, demonstrating who is inside the bubble, if you will, of American identity and who is not. Now, this theme continues during the Cold War. We can see the same imagery and language against Stalin, against Khrushchev, against Castro, against Ho Chi Minh. But I think it's important to move on to the section that I think is actually most important about this project, which is so what? The real thing I want you to take away from this project isn't that this happened. It did, and history is about telling you what happened. But it's important, I think, also to think about how this continues to resonate today. I point you to Saving Private Ryan, a movie that came out in the late 1990s about World War II. So, good historian moment, methodologically speaking, this is not something that tells us about World War II. It tells us about the 1990s. And I'll remind you of my favorite scene in that movie, when my favorite actor in that movie, the guy who plays the role of the sniper, he and his buddies are walking along in Normandy, complaining to Tom Hanks, the captain, and saying, "This is a stupid mission. We're all going to get killed saving this one guy. How can our 8 lives be worth his 1? This is a terrible mission." And they're complaining, at which point the sniper says, "I'm sorry, sir, I need to speak up. This is a terrible use of me as a military resource, he says. If you put me within 1.5 miles of Adolf Hitler with a clear line of sight, he says, boom, the war is over. The interesting thing is, everyone in the platoon agreed. Everyone said, yeah. At least this is how we understand World War II from the perspective of the 1990s. Hitler is so bad, Hitler is so tyrannical, Hitler is so awful, it's almost like he's got the Germans under a spell. We just need to kill him. And the war is over the next day. I can assure you, had Adolf Hitler died during World War II, it may have turned out quite differently, but the war would not have ended the next day. He had a lot of committed followers who wanted to continue his work. And in fact, we can see this logic play out in American policymaking today. The argument and the logic that if we are actually fighting against tyrants and fighting against monsters, the way to get rid of the problem is to get rid of the tyrant or the monster. Therefore, we have both Presidents George Bush, and I've purposely not told you which quote is from who, making the same point. Our problem is with the Iraqi dictator. Get rid of him, the argument goes, and things will be fine. In fact, I'll remind you how the 2003 American-led invasion of Iraq began. It didn't actually begin with the shock and awe massive bombing assault that we were promised. It began instead with an assassination attempt. Now, granted, an assassination attempt using cruise missiles, but the Americans got good, actionable intelligence that Saddam Hussein was at a place called Dora Farms about 48 hours before the war was to begin. And George Bush makes the command decision that we are going to try to kill Saddam Hussein that night. The argument being, we kill him, there is no need for war. My point being that this logic has become so ingrained in American thinking, it's actually gotten to the point where American policymakers have forgotten that this is rhetoric and actually think that that's how the world actually works. Further points. Saddam Hussein was offered the opportunity to go into exile by the Americans in advance of the invasion of 2003. Now, play with me a little game and remember that the war in 2003 was titularly fought initially because of the very real fear and threat, and in fact, assured knowledge, that the Iraqi leader possessed weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction that he might give to terrorists who would be more than happy to use them against America and our allies. If Saddam Hussein goes into exile, presumably he's not taking the weapons with him. Who's in charge of them? If Saddam Hussein dies in that first assassination attempt, and the weapons, which of course we all know didn't exist, but if they had, and policymakers I think were honest with themselves and thinking that they did, if they had, well, that just means that you've now basically given al-Qaeda all the opportunity it could ever want to acquire a weapon of mass destruction. Essentially, by playing out the logic of finding fault with tyrants and monsters, American policymakers have in the 21st century gotten to the point where we are constructing inadequate, unhelpful, counterintuitive strategies for how to solve our problems. Iraq was, of course, presented as a conflict in which not only was Saddam Hussein the problem, but the Iraqi people, you recall, were going to greet the American liberators with candy and flowers. It didn't quite work out that way. And this message was repeated to American soldiers time and again. My favorite example being American soldiers going into the field were given a deck of cards. You got to do something while you're waiting to ship out. You play cards, that's fine. But the deck of cards had the 52 most important Iraqi leaders. The idea being, if you're playing with these cards and you look at them from time to time, when you stumble upon one of those guys hiding in a hole, you'll recognize him. But the broader implication being, all you got to do is get rid of the tyrant and his henchmen, and everything will be fine after that. And of course, we know that Americans who concerned themselves, for example, in the war on terror, with finding and killing Osama bin Laden, finally succeeded in doing so, and yet I would argue terror still goes on. I'll end with this gentleman, Vladimir Putin, if you can't see from the back. As the war in in Ukraine took off 3 years ago now, this week, American commentators, left, right, and center, public and privately, made the following point. This is all Putin's fault. This is all Putin's fault. In fact, we have no quarrel with the Russian people. Our Secretary of State said exactly that. They are being duped. They are being controlled. It created a parlor game throughout Washington of people asking the following question. What if we just killed Putin? What if we just encouraged someone to kill Putin? Yes, what if we assassinated Putin? Which I think reinforces the idea that Americans think that there really is a magical power that tyrants have over their people, that the moment that they are eliminated, things will be fine. I assure you, if Vladimir Putin were not there, the next guy may be quite worse. That's a problem with tyrants. But of course, when we think about today, and we think about the ways in which American policy has changed, it's important to note that the language of Americans fighting dictators continues into this new administration. Donald Trump has said he is a dictator without elections. I'll leave it to you to remember which one of these two gentlemen he was referring to when he said that. Thank you for your time.
Well, Jeff, thank you for this. We have a lot to talk about, and we'll find out from the questions who has a quarrel with you and who doesn't have a quarrel with you. But we'll begin with
if you're not making people mad, you're not doing something right.
We will begin with the second-year master's degree students in the front row.
Is this the line of death?
This is the line of death here.
All right, I guess I've been deemed to fall on the sword first.
Sean, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Sean. I'm a second-year MISE student here. I'm from Canada, and
Hey, we're gonna be fellow citizens soon.
you can try. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, of course, was the difference between like the European kind of like dehumanization of the Germans and then the American style. Not sure if it was within your framework that you were referencing or if you just miss it. It seems to me pretty obvious that it would be counterproductive for the Europeans to use the same strategy when they still have monarchs. So they can't really use the same strategy of being like, oh, it's the Kaiser's fault. It's this one big leader in power who's not elected and just decides everything. That's very like, oh yeah, just hold up a mirror and you've suddenly got a big problem on your hands. Whereas that wasn't the same situation that the Americans necessarily had. I guess just your thoughts on it?
Well, that's very true. And I think that's why European propagandists really focused on the nature of the difference between their system and the other system. And in the United States, the difference was one of royalty/tyranny. For the British and the French, it was one of nationality. One might even go so far during the rhetoric of the time to say one of race or biology, that these were two separate peoples entirely, no bloodlines together, which is what enables you to be violent against them. One thing to remember, of course, is Woodrow Wilson had a real problem saying we are only fighting against tyrants and kings when the Russians and the British were on their side. His job became much easier when the Russians had a democratic revolution too.
So, dear Professor Engel, as you may remember, I'm Alex from MISE 2. And first of all, thank you very much for the lecture. And I think I will probably express the common sentiment that it was one of the most interesting and anecdotic lectures we've had in this room so far. And as for my question, there is the following opinion. Although the US has the strongest army on the globe, its real military capability is significantly limited by the very foundations that make America a good place to live in. For example, freedom of speech, high value of a soldier's life, mobilization being equal to political suicide, things I definitely advocate for, but they can and actually have tied hands of the military command in Vietnam, for example, and not only in fighting the so-called monsters we've been talking about. And in fact, it's quite problematic to defend democracy by democratic means. So my first, a more easy question is, do you agree that there is such a tension? And a more complicated one, if yes, how to deal with it? Thank you.
That's a great question. I do not agree whatsoever, and I have all the evidence on my side. But what you have pointed out is that there is the common perception. The common perception that the world operates, as Immanuel Kant suggested in the late 18th century, that democracies, peoples, when they are in charge, will not fight each other. So therefore, the logic went, as Kant explained, and as people rediscovered after the end of the Cold War, if you can create a world that's full of democracies and democracies don't fight each other, there'll be no war. In fact, it was actually kind of a fun political science parlor game at the end of the Cold War to note not only had no two democracies ever fought each other, no two countries with a McDonald's had ever fought each other. By the way, that's not true anymore. What's notable, though, is if you dig into the research, two things happen. The first is, well, three things. The first is correlation is not causation. Secondly, and more importantly, it turns out that democracies, on average, are actually much, much more aggressive and violent than autocracies. Democracies get into more wars, they just don't happen to fight each other. But public opinion requires, one argues, the democratic leaders to use force more frequently and more energetically. The second thing, and I think this plays back to the notion of Vietnam, is that there is a general perception repeated by American adversaries repeatedly, whether it's in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, War on Terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, that the American people have a limited appetite for suffering and a limited appetite for casualties. They are risk averse. All we need to do, the logic says, is to kill enough Americans that they'll get tired of this process and go home. It turns out, again, the data is actually the opposite. The data is very clear, I think, that Americans don't like losing troops, but what they really don't like is losing troops and losing wars. And they are actually quite willing to go and suffer additional casualties if they are seeing progress. This was the political science that underlay George W. Bush's decision to surge troops in Iraq in 2006, 2007. At the time when most Americans thought we're losing this war, his data came back from his pollsters, from his social scientists, and from his generals that the way to win is not to get out. The way to win public support is to start winning. Let's put more troops in. And it turns out, at least for a time being, until they started pulling those troops out again, Iraq did become somewhat more stable. And more importantly, for your question, the war became more popular during those months as well.
Good evening, Professor. My name is David. I'm from Colombia. And I was wondering if it can be said that Trump's approach to the EU when saying they were created to screw us is on brand with American diplomatic history of finding monsters to destroy. Is the same playbook the same case? And also, is it accurate to say that we can extrapolate the same approach of othering people to other institutions, in this case also the EU?
It's a great question. I run the Center for Presidential History. And I like to point out that people used to ask when we started up in 2012, why do we need to study presidential history? Since 2016, no one has asked me that question. It's become self-evident that one person can make that much difference. Which is why when I articulate the whole series of foundational beliefs that American policymakers have since 1945, Republican or Democrat, I can give you a whole list of things that every president agrees with, except Donald Trump. By the way, Donald Trump's people love it when I tell them that, because they voted for him to be different. So one of the ways is Americans actually were quite enthusiastic about the European process. Remember, the whole purpose of the European process, from the American perspective, and I think it was also the case originally from the German and the French, and then ultimately the European broader perspective, was this was how we're going to get out of the trap that we're in of having a war every 20 years. The only way to get rid of European proclivity for conflict was to first economically integrate, then politically integrate, and then ultimately get people to start thinking of themselves as European and not German, British, Belgian, or Italian. And once they make that cognitive leap, they won't go to war with each other anymore. American policymakers, who, by the way, their biggest problem in the world is that Europeans keep going to war with each other. In fact, it's not a joke when I say the real problem with Europe, from the perspective of most American administrations, is that it's unfortunately filled with Europeans. Yes, you were supposed to laugh at that. But it's also somewhat true, because the narrative that American policymakers have from 1945 up until Donald Trump, then again with Joe Biden, and then up until Donald Trump, is that Europeans go to war with each other unless we are there looking out for them, unless we're on site with NATO, and unless we have somebody who can get them to stop fighting with each other, like the European Union. So I think Donald Trump's, I don't want to assess necessarily what the President of the United States just said, save to say it is completely antithetical to everything every other president of the United States has said since 1945.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. My name is Kusai. I'm from Syria, also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. One cannot wonder that many of the monsters that the United States managed to destroy or dismantle in the recent history were at some point in history were hailed as friends of the US itself and even manufactured by the US. So there is a pattern that one can see here. The question is, what is the benefit for the United States internal policy of having someone that they agree with, then create him as a monster, then destroy him, not completely, as we've seen in many examples? How does that help with the internal policies for different administrations? Thank you.
It's a great question. So remember, when the United States historically supports authoritarian regimes, the expectation is that that's going to continue. The United States has supported authoritarian regimes with the expectation that that authoritarian is going to continue being our friend and ally. Most of the time, that's true. Sometimes it's not. Manuel Noriega is a great example. Manuel Noriega is a good ally of the United States up until the moment when he's not. And the rhetoric that George H.W. Bush used when justifying the invasion of Panama was Noriega has begun to operate in ways that are hurting his own people. We need to go in and save them. Now, I think you're alluding to, when you say diminish an enemy but only a little, probably you're alluding to Saddam Hussein. The Taliban? There were very, very good reasons not to occupy Iraq in 1991. I think we saw all of them play out after 2003. But one of the most important reasons that the Bush administration in 91 did not continue on to Baghdad or did not keep fighting until they had eliminated Saddam Hussein was the very real expectation that the Iraqi military or the Iraqi people are going to take care of Saddam Hussein. What usually happens to authoritarian leaders when they get their butts kicked in war? They get killed themselves. The policymakers in the George H.W. Bush administration were very clear that, you know, we give Saddam Hussein, I don't know, 0.1% chance of surviving. Well, that's why we buy lottery tickets. Sometimes crazy odds happen. And that's also the same logic that was used in 2003 to say why we need to get rid of Saddam was he is going to continue to be a problem until we give his people the opportunity to eject him by helping them along. So I'm not entirely sure. We'll have to talk later about the Taliban. I'm not entirely sure I understand that part of your question, but do you want me to?
No, we could go
Okay,
on.
yeah.
Amin?
Thank you very much, Professor, for this interesting lecture. I would like to ask you about Trump's policy regarding Europe and Russia. I think many of us are a bit worried about it. Some argue that Trump wants to get closer with Russia, to have a stronger hand, a stronger position when it comes to China, but while he's doing that, he's actually losing out, he's pushing the Europeans away. So what do you think about that? Do you think that with the current priorities in Asia, he just values the Russians more as partners, or do you think it's maybe just on an individual base that he just sympathizes with strong leaders and that he has a personal affection for President Putin?
It is very hard to come up with any rationale that helps fully explain Donald Trump's foreign policy vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin and Russia. We were just talking about this before, that when I lecture on World War II, the first thing I do is put up two graphs, one with the population and GDP of the Allies and the other with the population and GDP of the Axis. In case you're wondering, there's a real difference. So I am flummoxed and perplexed, and whatever word you want to use, why our administration would choose to ally with a country that is minuscule compared to the rest of Europe. Yeah, they have nuclear weapons, but so do we. So count me among the people who don't understand what Donald Trump is doing as an international strategy, save to say I think he's doing it either for for domestic political reasons, or, I don't know, he likes Putin.
All right, well, we have gone through the, what did you call it? The row of death here in the front. We can now open the discussion to everybody, and we need a lady in the back there, I see. And Josephine is coming around with the microphone here.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. Thank you so much for the super interesting lecture. I guess my question would be, why of all did the American president have a quarrel with the Japanese people?
Because it was an easy way to get Americans to fight the Japanese. There's two things going on. There's a push and a pull. The Japanese were not, at that time, inside the basis of American identity. If you said all-American boy, Americans didn't picture somebody who was Japanese. By the way, one thing I didn't mention is my estimation, until something else fundamentally changed in the international system, is that Americans, presidents, will only use this rhetoric when going to war. Donald Trump, again, might be an exception. Because since 1965 and the expansion of immigration, people from out the world come to the United States, and you literally cannot bomb a country in the world without wondering how their population at home is going to react. And if you really believe the argument, which again, I don't think Donald Trump does, but if you really believe the argument that anyone can become an American just by joining up, again, I don't think he believes that, then the only way you can justify killing is by saying it's to liberate and get rid of tyrants. Now, in World War II, I think it was much easier for Franklin Roosevelt and others to simply say, these people aren't like us, let's wipe them out.
Okay, we have a question here, and then next we have a question on the other side.
Thank you very much. Luca Fetta, I'm also a student here at the DA. And my question goes directly along to what was just asked and what you mentioned, because I would like to discuss maybe the causes a little bit more about this fighting individuals versus fighting ethnicities, and whether that's just classic racism and xenophobia. And if so, have you found in your research that there are like institutional drivers that foster in the ubiquity of anti-immigrant or anti-religious rhetorics, or are there path dependencies that make basing a war or an argument on ethnic cleavages easier than on political ones?
So one of the things I did not anticipate when I began this book, I should point out, I began this book, this hopefully will be either useful to our graduate students or depressing to them. I began this book in graduate school because Bill Clinton just said we have no quarrel with Slobodan Milosevic at the same time that my professor said we have no quarrel with Woodrow Wilson. Or Woodrow Wilson has no quarrel with the Kaiser, with the German people. Over the course of time, different things have intervened. And I've had to work on other projects first. And this has always been kind of a pocket passion of mine, which I'm finally focusing on. And I say that because I am surprised myself that almost every single chapter hinges on the question of race. As a foreign policy historian, I will tell you that race is the most important factor in all of American history, writ none. And I have long discussions in the book about how people are going to be uncomfortable with that because people don't like to remember the way the past actually was. Saying the United States was racist is not the same as saying the United States is racist. We had chattel slavery, for example. That's kind of hard to refute, though the governor of Florida has tried. So at the end of the day, the fundamental element of race, of citizenship and of who belongs is racial. And we know this because there's a pattern in American history, which we're seeing playing out today, very consistent pattern, that whenever a new group shows up, say the Germans in the 1750s, say the Irish in the 1840s, whenever a new group shows up, they are discriminated against and beaten on and told they cannot be good Americans. And that continues up until the time when the next new group shows up, at which point the Germans or the Irish or others say, no, now we're real Americans. Those people are even weirder. So that happens, and I think most of the time it's interpreted as a racial element. And then one other thing, not to make this too academic, but we have to remember that race is a social construct, so it's changing all the time, what we think of race. So Theodore Roosevelt's definition of race is not your and my definition of race. He thought of it more in terms of blood, and you could have different peoples of different, it's complicated. But race is always the factor that matters most. And I did not expect that to be the case when I wrote this book.
Okay.
Thank you. Erich Kandler, born and raised in Vienna, Austria, but a Fulbright student some 40 years ago, so that's why I get to sit next to Hermann. Just a question for a professor of presidential history. Over the last 200-odd years, has there ever been a situation where a US president / government has teamed up with what we would call a monster? What could be the reasons why, if there is such a thing, why would they have done it? Because they can't beat them, or for personal reasons, or whatever. So maybe if you think back quickly, I'm not sure you know them all, when did they team up? What was the reasoning for that? Maybe that tells us the thinking of your current president. Thank you.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of, to be honest, there's a lot of examples. But it refers back to the earlier question that people who go down in history as monsters were not always monsters from the American perspective. During the Mexican-American War, for example, as the United States tried to find what element of the troubled Mexican regime they could work with, at different times, they celebrated different members of the Mexican regime, including Santa Anna, who becomes the great villain of the Mexican-American War. I'm from Texas, trust me. Similarly, one really impressive monster that's hard to overlook is that from 1946 until 1953, American policy was aimed at Joseph Stalin and his henchmen. From 1941 to 1945, he was good old Uncle Joe. So it is unfortunately situational. Why? Because I'm glad you asked that. One of the premises which I begin my Presidents and Foreign Policy course is we assume as a fundamental rule that every single administration, every single president, every single policymaker, every single diplomat, every single economist, everybody is trying their best and trying their best for their country. The idea of America first, which by the way is not a new phrase with Donald Trump, is actually a little silly because of course the Obama administration was trying their best. They just had a different vision. Of course the Nixon administration was trying their best. They just had a different vision. I will tell you, I had a really frightening experience 2 years ago when I made this point. The class has got about 160 students. I made this point that it's just incredibly obvious that we begin from the premise that every administration is trying their best. And I saw two kids in the back shaking their head. And I said, I'm sorry, you don't agree? And they said, oh no. And I said, you don't think Joe Biden is doing what he thinks is best for America? And they said, oh no, he's trying to destroy America. He hates America. I said, moving on. You know, there's nothing I can do at that point except to say I don't believe that's correct. So in the answer to the question of why we oftentimes align ourselves with people who are either bad or subsequently get referred to as bad, it's because at that moment it's in America's best interest. And it is one of the frightening things, I think, about the second Trump administration that we've seen in its first 5 weeks is that previous administrations, going all the way back to George Washington, even when they were doing something that we might call realpolitik, they would still wrap it in the veneer of democracy promotion. One word that you have not heard Donald Trump say, at least one word that I have not heard Donald Trump say since he's been in office, is democracy. He is not interested in promoting democracy. That's not what he thinks matters, which is, again, a fundamental shift from every administration till now.
Yeah, well, he is a king, he says. We're running out of time. I think we have time, Joseph. We have two people who've been waiting here in the center for a long time. One in the front and one in the middle.
I think this gentleman here is who has it.
My name is Gertrude Ullmark, and I have a question. Also, the question is, I think that the now President of the United States wants to override, to be at the least, your democratic institutions as there are, the jurisdiction and the Congress. I don't think that he wants to, also he basically wants to work with them. I think he wants to override them. First, do you think this too? Second, how strong do you think are these institutions? How likely is it that Trump will override them?
Should we collect them?
Well, let me just answer that real quick. Just to say, Do I think he wants to override other institutions? Yes. Do I think he's interested in the Constitution? I'm not entirely sure Donald Trump has read the Constitution. And I mean that quite seriously. But the real problem is the system was set up by the architects of the Constitution so that the other elements would push back, Congress or the courts. The founders did not anticipate a scenario where Congress would so thoroughly roll over and the courts would so thoroughly roll over. If you think about what, I said I was going to answer this quickly, I'm sorry. If you think about what Speaker Mike Johnson said 2 weeks ago, when asked, what do you think about the fact that the Trump administration is refusing to spend money that Congress has appropriated? Every other previous speaker would have said, well, we're drawing up the impeachment papers. And Johnson said, hey, it sounds great. Elon Musk's a smart guy. So we need another generation of people in the legislative and judicial branch to be willing to recognize that their job, literally, is to defend their institution.
Okay, we have two final questions, one there and then one there.
All right. So my name is Arslan. I'm from the Central European University. First of all, thank you so much for such an insightful lecture. You've actually addressed some of the points that I wanted to ask, but maybe I'll just continue on what you were saying regarding this kind of animosity that endures like right after the conflict and also before and during the conflict between the people, let's say, of the United States or any country for that matter, and the people from the opposing side. So let's take the examples again of Americans and Japanese. But don't you think that apart from race and apart from any kind of like lack of cultural or racial proximity, there could also be some other considerations such as, let's say, the opposing nations like industrial capabilities or natural wealth at the same time. So one can argue that, for example, there was no animosity between Americans and Germans precisely because the Americans were considering that after the war, considering Germany's like very significant industrial potential, there could be some kind of like a rapprochement, as we say in IR, between the two nations, while there was a very limited chance of that when it comes to Japan, for example, or China for that matter. And I think that we're seeing the same thing now with the potential rapprochement between Americans and Russians because of Russia's massive industrial wealth and also because of the massive capabilities that the Russian oligarchy has in terms of investment in America, also in light of like the recent news that Donald Trump announced this golden visa with a $5 million investment. So don't you think that there could be some other considerations in this direction? Thanks.
I'm impressed that you said massive Russian industrial wealth.
Not industrial, maybe fossil fuel. Well, yeah, I guess it was just like too late in the day already.
No, I think actually you've actually proven my point, because there are multiple reasons that countries go into conflict and go into war. If you ask me why does the United States and Japan go to war, my first answer is not because they're racial others. My first answer is, well, they're competing for strategic resources. My first answer is they're competing for East Asian supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. Race is the frame in which the war is finally fought. So we know this to be true because once the war is over, the United States rebuilds not just, to your point, its cultural cousin Germany, it also rebuilds its cultural other Japan. Making both of them, by the way, by the 1980s, arguably more economically threatening than they were in the 1930s. So I think, is there a possibility of rapprochement? I'm all in favor of rapprochement. I would love if Donald Trump ends the war tomorrow, that would be worth considering depending on the parameters. And a world in which Russia and the United States get along together is great. I am perplexed, distressed, when I see in the United Nations the United States voting with Russia, North Korea, and Belarus, and not with every other one of its allies.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, just having spent a little bit of time in Russia and recently in Ukraine and being an American, I'm firm belief that if you're not talking, you're fighting, and that's what's going on now. And I think Trump, one of his statements was that war is a waste of resources and time and energy, and I just want your comment on a couple of things. And you know, Putin's been around for 6 presidents. He's been 25 years, and a Russian told me that Putin is Russia and Russia is Putin. And the Chinese are kind of the same way, that they have a long-term goal, and they're working they're not invading anybody, they're not fighting anybody, but from a business standpoint and an economic standpoint, they're just tromping over everybody. And I was at an event, and I was talking to a Chinese individual, and I said, you know, there's struggle between the U.S. and China, and for economic dominance, and this. I said, there's no struggle, it's over. And from their perspective, that deal's already been done, and the Europeans have been having economic relationships with Russia for years, and I lived almost 20 years in Norway before moving to Austria, and they've had a very historically good relationship. They share a border. I've been up there recently. There's absolutely the biggest concern at the border is when the tourist shop is going to open, and actually even today the Russians come across the border and do their shopping in Norway because they have this agreement, and the Russian fishing boats are dropping their catch in Norway, but at the same time there's this diplomatic back and forth. Now, can democracy overcome the short-term vision of democracies? Can it overcome and compete with these other nations that seem to be adversarial from time to time, or boogeymen from time to time, given our short-term vision and changing of politics every 4 years? And you know, Europe is just as chaotic as the U.S. They just do it in a much quieter way.
So, answer to your first point, I'm in favor of peace. This is a diplomatic academy. I'd much rather, as Winston Churchill said, it's better the jaw than the war. And you are absolutely correct that you don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your adversaries. I am concerned that my president does not appreciate who their adversary is in searching for a peace. But if you're asking the broader question, will democracy succeed in the 21st century? As a historian, I would tell you that is exactly the question that people were asking in the 1890s. And that turned out okay. That's exactly the question that people were asking in the early 1800s. Democracy as a mode of government and social construction has not lost yet. So I realize this is a bad analogy, first because it's untrue and second because it's football. But I don't usually bet against Patrick Mahomes because he wins most of the time. Historically, democracies win most of the time.
All right, well, on that optimistic note, there we go. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. I think we are very, very lucky to have you here with us this spring. And for those of us at the Diplomatic Academy, we can carry on with these discussions all the way until graduation. So,
well, and the other thing is, you may all feel free to put as one of the 5 things you did this week, went to a lecture. So.
Okay. All right, we can adjourn next door now. Thanks, Jeff.